All right, let's jump into this deep dive. This time we're looking ahead, going beyond the nuts and bolts of agroecology.
Sounds good to me.
We're focused on the conclusion of this handbook you wanted to explore.
Okay.
Specifically, future directions for social sustainability and what actions we need to take farmers, communities, policymakers, the whole shebang.
It's fascinating how this handbook really pushes for putting these principles into practice. Doesn't just stop at the theory, you know?
Yeah, definitely gets down to brass tacks, which I know is right up your alley.
Absolutely. Actionable stuff.
So we've established that agroecology isn't just about swapping chemical fertilizers for compost, right?
Right.
It's about making sure farming works with nature. A&D benefits communities fairly. But the million-dollar question is, how do we actually get tea there?
Well, the conclusion makes it clear this isn't a solo mission for farmers.
Definitely not.
It's a symphony, a whole orchestra of action. We need communities, practitioners on the ground, even the folks making policies.
So many moving parts. It's like a giant puzzle.
Exactly. And the handbook really dives into the specifics of what each group can do.
Okay, give me an example. What's one concrete thing the handbook suggests?
Well, it emphasizes that communities can't just be passive. They can't just sit back and watch, you know?
Right.
They need to actively shape how their food systems evolve.
So it's more than just going to those town hall meetings.
Much more. We're talking about having a real say, real ownership.
Makes sense. But how?
The handbook gives some cool examples. Community gardens, for one.
Love those.
There's also farmer-to-farmer knowledge exchanges and even tailored training programs.
So really meeting people where they are.
Exactly. It's about empowering communities to take charge of their food future.
I like that. Taking charge, being proactive.
And that kind of proactivity extends to tech as well.
Uh-oh, here comes the robot farmer talk.
Not quite. The handbook is actually very cautious about tech. It emphasizes responsible use.
Responsible how?
It has to serve the goals of agroecology. We shouldn't just be throwing tech at the problem for the sake of it.
So what's a good example of tech being used the right way?
Think mobile apps that connect farmers with crucial info, or online platforms for sharing experiences across continents.
So using technology to bridge those gaps. I like it.
It's about amplifying human connection, not replacing it.
And it seems like knowledge sharing is a recurring theme here.
You're right. It pops up everywhere. Farmer to farmer, community training, even tech-driven connections.
Making sure the right knowledge gets to the right people at the right time.
Exactly. And it's not just the what of agroecology, but the why. People need to grasp the deeper implications of these practices.
The why. Okay, unpack that for me.
How it impacts their lives, communities, the environment. It's about connecting those dots.
Between our choices and the world we want to live in.
You got it. And that brings us to something that really resonated with me. The handbook's emphasis on ethical consumption.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Using our buying power, our everyday choices, to actually support agroecology.
So it's more than just a feel-good thing. It actually has an impact.
Absolutely. It's saying, hey, we're not just passive consumers. We have agency.
Each choice we make adds up.
Right. Exactly. Whether we buy local produce, offer fair trade, or support businesses aligned with these values.
So even picking between two brands of tomatoes at the store can be part of this bigger movement.
You got it. And that power multiplies when we start talking about collective action.
Like a snowball effect.
Exactly. Even the most dedicated farmer can't single-handedly change the system.
True.
But when consumers, communities, policymakers all pull in the same direction, that's when we see real change.
Like a giant tug-of-war, but we're all on the same side.
I love that analogy. And that's the spirit the handbook promotes.
It's a call to action.
It is. It says we all have a stake in this and we all have a role to play.
I like that. And the best part is the handbook backs it up with actual examples of agroecology in action.
Right. It's not just pie in the sky. It's happening already.
We've got the Tigray Project in Ethiopia, restoring degraded land, the campesino movement, spreading knowledge farmer to farmer.
Don't forget Sikkim, a whole state in India that's gone completely organic.
Incredible stories. It's almost like a sneak peek into a possible future.
Exactly. But the handbook doesn't shy away from the challenges either. There are hurdles, no doubt about it.
Okay, so what's one major challenge it highlights? Spill the tea.
Well, it talks about ensuring those amazing agroecological products actually reach consumers.
Ah, yes. What's the point of growing it if it just sits there?
Exactly. So the handbook stresses the need for policies that create a level playing field.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of policies are we talking about?
Things like supporting local food systems, ensuring fair pricing for farmers, and tackling those food deserts where people lack access to fresh, healthy options.
So it's not just about growing differently, it's about transforming the whole system.
You got it. From growing to distribution to how we value food to who benefits.
It sounds like a pretty big to-do list.
It is, but the handbook makes it clear we're not starting from scratch.
Thank goodness for that.
We have growing knowledge, tons of practical experience from those examples we talked about, and most importantly, a passionate community pushing for this vision.
So it's not about reinventing the wheel, it's about refining it, making it better.
Exactly, and figuring out those specific actions each of us can take.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What are some key takeaways for farmers, for communities, for policymakers?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. And that's precisely what we'll be diving into in part 2. All right, welcome back to our deep dive. We've painted the big picture. Now it's time to zoom in on those specific actions. What can folks actually do to make this agroecology vision happen?
Right, because it's easy to talk about collaboration and big changes. But where does the rubber meet the road?
Good question. And thankfully, the handbook gets into those nitty-gritty details.
Lay it on me.
And it starts with, well, who else? The farmers.
The heart of the matter, right.
Yeah.
But what does the handbook suggest they should be focusing on?
It goes deeper than just use this technique, plant that crop. One big point is that agroecology requires farmers to become lifelong learners.
Makes sense, because it's not like a static set of rules. Things are always changing.
Exactly. It's evolving. It demands adaptation. What works in one place, in one climate?
Could be a disaster somewhere else, right?
Yep. So the handbook encourages farmers not just to learn techniques, but the principles behind them.
So they understand the WHY, not just the HOW.
You got it. Experiment, observe, become an expert in your unique context.
Yeah, there's that farmer-to-farmer exchange again.
Yep, like those farmer field schools or the campesino movement.
Whereas farmers teaching farmers.
Exactly. Sharing what works, what doesn't, no fancy jargon, just practical stuff.
Makes those tough conversations a little easier.
For sure. But the handbook also talks about bridging that gap between the folks on the ground.
And the scientists in their labs.
You got it. Two-way street of knowledge.
Farmers bringing their experience, researchers bringing the science to back it up.
It's like a feedback loop. Farmers are the eyes and ears. Researchers help make sense of it all.
A nice image.
But it goes beyond just boosting yields. This collaboration needs to address those social and economic aspects too.
Right, because what's the point of a productive farm if the farmer can't make a living or the community doesn't benefit?
Exactly. So the handbook says farmers need to be advocates, not just for their own farms, but for policies that support all the little guys.
Policies for fair trade, a truly equitable system.
You got it. But that's a tall order, right? Like asking farmers to be activists on top of everything else.
Definitely. Sounds like they're going to need backup.
Which is where those communities we talked about come in.
Power in numbers, right?
Agroecology needs people demanding change, not just waiting for it to happen.
Okay, so what's the community's game plan? What can they do?
It's not just about protests and petitions. It's more about weaving those agroecological values into everyday life.
Give me an example. What would that look like practically?
Participating in those local food policy councils, so you have a say.
Right, getting involved where decisions are made.
Supporting farmers markets, creating that direct connection with producers.
Cutting out the middleman.
Exactly. Or even starting community gardens. Builds that shared responsibility for our food.
Like we're bringing it back to a human scale.
Exactly. And this all ties into another big thing, consumer awareness.
Vote with your wallet and all that.
Yep. But the handbook goes deeper than just buy organic.
Because sometimes it feels like my grocery choices are a drop in the bucket. Does it really matter which tomatoes I buy?
That's what I love about the handbook. It encourages a more thoughtful approach to ethical consumption.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Consider where your food comes from, how it was grown, who's impacted by your choice.
So I'm not just a shopper. I'm an informed citizen making choices that matter.
You got it. Maybe you pick the local tomatoes, even if they're a bit pricier. Maybe you choose a fair trade coffee brand or join a CSA.
So I'm putting my money where my mouth is, literally.
Exactly. And those choices, multiplied by millions of people, can shift the market.
Giving power back to the producers who are doing things right.
You're getting it. And these choices become even more powerful when we combine them with collective action.
Give me an example. What does that look like?
Advocating for policies that back up agroecology, pushing for more sustainable sourcing at our supermarkets, restaurants.
Using our voices and our wallets.
Exactly. It's not just a shopping list anymore. It's a movement.
I like that. A movement towards something better. But let's be honest, not everyone's going to be an agroecology enthusiast right off the bat.
True, some folks need a little more convincing.
And that's where education and outreach come in, right?
Big time. But the handbook stresses that it can't just be any old education.
No boring lectures. Keep it snappy.
Exactly. It needs to be engaging, accessible, relevant. Think school gardens, where kids learn by doing.
Hands-on experience.
Or farm tours, connecting people directly to where their food comes from.
Instead of just seeing rows of produce at the store.
You got it. Even social media can be powerful, telling those compelling stories about agroecology in action.
Making it real, relatable.
Exactly. When people understand why it matters, they're more likely to get on board. But we also need to make sure all these efforts are actually working, right?
The age-old question. How do we measure success?
Right. Can't just be based on feel-good stories.
We need some cold, hard facts.
Exactly. That's why the handbook stresses monitoring and evaluation, gathering real data.
So measuring soil health, water usage, biodiversity.
Yep. And not just generic stuff, but figuring out the indicators that matter in each context.
So being adaptable, learning from what the data tells us.
Exactly. Because agroecology isn't a one-size-fits-all solution.
It's a journey, an ongoing process.
Exactly. And speaking of working together, we can't forget those big players, policymakers.
Yes, time to talk about the people who can actually make those systemic changes happen.
But what should they be focusing on?
It's not just about throwing money at the problem.
Although funding never hurts.
True. But the handbook lays out a roadmap for effective policy. It starts with shifting those incentives we talked about.
Yeah.
Because right now, a lot of policies actually reward the unsustainable stuff.
Yeah.
It's backwards.
Exactly. So the handbook says, flip the script. Make it more beneficial for farmers to choose those agroecological practices.
Subsidies for cover cropping, tax breaks for organic farms.
You got it. Maybe even payments for ecosystem services. Reward farmers for the good they're doing for the environment.
Putting our money where our mouths are, for real.
And it's not just about individual farms. We need to invest in infrastructure that strengthens local food systems.
Farmers markets, community kitchens, those food hubs that connect producers and consumers directly.
Shorter supply chains, more community control, farmers getting to know their customers.
Sounds ideal.
And policy can make it happen. Think about school lunch programs prioritizing local ingredients or government buying agroecological products.
Using the power of those big institutions to drive demand.
Exactly. But let's face it, policy change can be slow. So what can we do in the meantime?
Aside from patiently twiddling our thumbs.
The handbook says get involved. Learn about the issues, contact those elected officials, make some noise.
Be an active citizen, right?
Yep. But those demands need to be backed up by evidence, which is where research and innovation come in.
So it's not just about proving agroecology works. We need to know more.
Exactly. Understand the long-term impacts, develop new technologies that support sustainability, and make sure those innovations are accessible to everyone.
So research feeds into practice. Practice raises new research questions, and the whole field just keeps getting better.
You got it. But it can't happen in a bubble. The handbook is big on participatory research.
Bringing in those farmers and communities, not just as test subjects, but as partners.
They've got so much knowledge to share, helps make sure those solutions are actually relevant.
It's a team effort, scientists and farmers working side by side.
Now, we've talked farmers, communities, researchers, but there's another key group. Food businesses.
The big players. Supermarkets, restaurants, the folks who have a lot of say in what ends up on our plates.
Exactly. And the handbook challenges them to take responsibility for their sourcing practices.
Time to ditch those anonymous, globalized supply chains.
Right. It's about prioritizing those local, regional producers who are using agroecological methods.
So choosing the farmer who's treating the land and their workers right, even if it costs a bit more.
You got it. And it's not just about buying. The handbook stresses building partnerships with those farmers, supporting their transition to agroecology, making sure everyone benefits.
So it's not just about profit, it's about fairness too.
Exactly. And here's something interesting for those businesses who are, let's be honest, motivated by the bottom line.
Okay, I'm listening.
The handbook points out that consumer demand for ethical, sustainable products is booming. People are paying attention and they're willing to pay more for it.
So being sustainable is good for business.
Exactly. So the handbook encourages businesses to be loudy about their sustainable practices.
No more hiding it in the fine print.
Right. Use that marketing power to educate consumers, advocate for change, and be a leader in this movement.
Businesses have a huge platform to influence what people buy. They could really make a difference.
Exactly. But let's not forget, changing our food system is about more than just business or consumer choices. We've got to tackle those bigger issues like poverty, inequality, access to land.
Those deep-rooted problems that often get overlooked.
And the handbook doesn't shy away from them. It says agroecology can't truly succeed unless we address those root causes.
We need policies that promote land reform, support those small-scale farmers.
And ensure the benefits of agroecology reach everyone. It's not just about sustainability, it's about justice, too.
Making sure everyone has a chance to thrive.
And not just today, but for future generations, too. We've got to think long-term.
Leaving a healthy planet for our kids and grandkids.
The handbook encourages us to consider those long-term consequences, protect our resources, fight climate change, build resilience.
It's a big shift in how we think about food and our relationship with nature.
It is. But amidst all these big ideas, I'm also curious about the more practical side of it all, seeing how it actually works.
The real-world success stories.
You got it, and that's exactly what we'll be diving into in part 3.
Okay, story time. We've talked big picture, we've talked action steps, and now I want to hear those inspiring stories of agroecology in action.
Me too. The theory's all well and good, but seeing it actually work is what gets me excited.
And thankfully, the handbook delivers on that. Lots of great examples.
Tons, real proof that this isn't just some hippie dream.
Especially those community-led initiatives, the ones where people just took matters into their own hands, like that campesino movement. What was it about that one that stood out?
It's amazing, really, how they flipped the script on traditional agricultural extension. You know, usually it's some outside expert coming in, telling farmers what to do.
The top-down approach.
Exactly. But here, it's farmers teaching farmers, sharing their experiences, figuring out what works for them.
So it's like this big, decentralized knowledge network. The farmers become the experts themselves.
And the handbook actually cites a study showing that these farmer-to-farmer exchanges...
They were effective.
Hugely. 25% increase in adoption of key practices compared to just 5% with the traditional top-down way.
Wow. That's a huge difference.
Right. So it's not just about feel-good community vibes. It has a real impact.
Measurable results. I like it.
And it goes beyond just the techniques. It builds trust. It helps communities take ownership of their food systems.
They're not just waiting for someone else to fix things.
Exactly. The campesino movement is all about finding your own OBUN solutions, using what you already know, what works in your specific context.
They're using techniques like intercropping, right? Growing different plants together.
Yep. Improves the soil, keeps those pesky bugs away. They're even creating their own seed banks.
So they don't have to rely on those big companies.
Exactly. More control, more independence.
It's inspiring to see what they've accomplished. But what about those places where the deck is really stacked against them, like those areas where the environment has already been degraded?
Ah, yes, the tough cases. That's where a story like the Tigray Project in Ethiopia comes in.
That was one dealing with severe land degradation.
Right, one of the toughest environments you can imagine. Deforestation, overgrazing, the soil was depleted, water was scarce, food insecurity was rampant.
Sounds pretty dire.
It was. But what's amazing is how they managed to turn things around. And a big part of that was putting the community front and center.
So not just coming in with some pre-packaged solution.
No way.
Yeah.
They held community meetings, training sessions, worked together to create a plan that addressed the specific needs of that region.
They actually listened to the people who live there.
Exactly. And they recognized the importance of combining traditional knowledge with science.
Not dismissing those time-tested practices.
Right. So, for example, they introduced check dams to prevent erosion, which is a modern technique, but they adapted those designs using local materials, local building methods.
Blending old and new.
And they revived traditional practices like agroforestry, planting trees alongside crops.
Creating those diverse ecosystems.
And the results. Well, the handbook talks about significant increases in vegetation, the soil becoming healthier, even wildlife returning to the area.
Wow, that's amazing.
Right. Food security improved, people started making more money, and there is this renewed sense of community.
Because they were all working together towards a common goal.
Exactly. So it shows that even in the face of huge challenges, we can restore things, we can rebuild.
We just need the right approach. But those were both very grassroots initiatives. What happens when you try to apply this at a larger scale, like at the government level?
Ah, good question. That's where a story like Sikkim, India comes in.
The first fully organic state, almost hard to believe.
Right. Back in 2003, they decided to completely transform their agricultural system.
What motivated such a radical change?
It was a mix of things. They were worried about their fragile mountain ecosystems, how chemical-intensive farming was harming them, and they were concerned about their people's health, too.
So it was about the environment and day of the people, a more holistic view.
Exactly. And they didn't rush into it. It was a step-by-step process with lots of farmer training, public awareness campaigns, and a whole policy framework to help farmers make the transition.
So it wasn't just, okay, no more chemicals, good luck.
No. They even set up a certification system to make sure those organic products were the real deal.
Really thorough. And what were the outcomes of all this? Did it actually work?
The handbook highlights some pretty impressive studies showing improvements in soil health, water quality, biodiversity.
So ticking all those environmental boxes. But what about the farmers themselves?
Many of them actually saw their yields and profits increase because they could sell those organic products at a premium price.
Good for the planet, A&D, good for the wallet.
Exactly. Plus, Sikkim has become a major ecotourism destination. People are drawn to that pristine environment.
And I bet there's a lot of national pride in that accomplishment.
Absolutely. It's proof that large-scale organic agriculture is possible.
It sets a pretty high bar for other regions to follow.
Definitely. But, amidst all this excitement, it's important to ask, are there any downsides? Are there trade-offs to going all in on agroecology?
Right, because nothing's ever perfect.
Exactly. And the handbook does acknowledge those challenges. One concern is that organic farming, even though it's good for the environment, might not produce as much food as conventional methods.
Which is a big deal, especially with a growing population to feed.
For sure. But the handbook points to research showing that agroecology can actually be just as productive, sometimes even more productive, especially over the long haul.
As the soil gets healthier, the whole system becomes more efficient.
Right. And it emphasizes that we need to tackle those bigger issues like food waste and our dietary choices.
Because how we eat matters just as much as how we grow the food.
Exactly. So the handbook's conclusion is really a call for a collective shift. It's saying we're all interconnected, our food choices have a huge impact.
It's about moving beyond that us versus them thinking.
Exactly. We're all in this together. Farmers, consumers, scientists, policymakers, businesses. Everyone has a role to play. And the handbook uses this great metaphor to illustrate this.
Oh, I do love a good metaphor. Lay it on me.
It describes agroecology as a tapestry made up of all these different threads,
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Each thread represents a different group, a different action, a different perspective.
And you need all those threads to create something strong and beautiful.
Exactly. And this tapestry is still being woven. There's room for everyone to add their own thread.
I love that.
So the question is, what will your thread be?
What a fantastic question to end on.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with me. Remember, even small actions can make a difference.
And until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those agroecological fires burning.